Valve is now facing a 656 million lawsuit in the UK over Steam pricing. Steam Deck adoption is climbing faster than Linux has ever, and the European Union might force publishers to stop killing games forever. Finally, that's gonna be up for public discussion. And yeah, there's a lot to unpack this week, and I'm standing up for the first time. So without further ado, let's jump in with the news. Welcome back to Steam Flow, where I break down Steam, Steam Deck, Steam hardware, and PC gaming news. Let's start with something that could genuinely change gaming preservation forever. Now, the Stop Destroying Video Games initiative, part of the wider Stop Killing Games movement, has officially crossed 1.29 million verified signatures. And that means that it now qualifies for a formal response and public hearing in the European Parliament. Now, this initiative calls for publishers selling or licensing games in the EU to leave them in a functional state even after official support ends, preventing publishers from remotely disabling games people have already paid for. Now, this movement was largely organized because of a single developer, Ubisoft, who shut down the original The Crew game, but many different developers are involved in this practice. On January 26, the call for public hearing was officially submitted, and the website of the EU Commission has an official news statement about that. The European Commission now has until July 27, 2026 to respond, and a public hearing will follow. Personally, I think this is long overdue. If I buy a game, especially a single-player one, I shouldn't lose access because a server shuts down, or a publisher changes direction, or they shut down their entire store. This isn't about piracy or entitlement, it's about ownership, preservation, and respecting the people who paid for these games in the first place. Now, do you guys think publishers should be legally required to keep games playable offline? Should they keep paying for servers, or try and patch the game so it can be played locally or hosted locally? Let me know in the comments below. On to the next piece of news. The GDC 2026 State of the Game Industry Report is out, and it's based on over 2,300 developers, and some of these numbers are especially interesting for Steam Deck owners. First, the rough stuff. 70% of developers were laid off in the last year and 11% in the last 2 years, mostly due to studio closures and acquisitions. Again, Ubisoft is highly involved in that one. Maybe some due to AI. However, that wasn't specifically disclosed. And on to AI, generative AI to be specific. 36% of developers say they personally use it, while 52% say that their company uses it. But here's the kicker, 52% believe AI has a negative impact on the gaming industry, and only 7% think it's positive. And I think this is good news for us gamers. I don't mind the use of AI as an assistant, but generative AI is just a big pile of slop right now. I prefer if they were not to use it at all. Now to the good news. PC remains king at 83% for gaming, but Steam Deck is now directly targeted by 28% of developers, with 40% expressing interest in targeting it in the future, and Linux alone sits at 8%. This is the most important stat in the entire report for Deck owners, because this means the Steam Deck isn't a Linux experiment anymore, it's a defined platform developers actively optimize for. And while I hate people calling it a console because it's a PC, not a console, it's safe to say that it is its own platform. And that's exactly why we're seeing better performance profiles, better controller support, fewer Proton headaches, and more playable and verified games on Steam Deck. Did you actually know that we recently surpassed over 25,000 playable and verified games on Steam Deck? And have you personally noticed better Steam Deck support over the last year? Do you think nowadays it's less tinkering and trying to get the game work and more playing straight out of the box? Let me know in the comments below. And keep this in mind, because this context matters a lot for the Valve lawsuit we're going to talk about. Now, a quick but useful update. Valve pushed new Steam Deck beta client updates this week. There was 2 of them. Achievements now get custom notification sounds and toasts. Lock screen behavior has been cleaned up, and desktop mode now better explains what tools are and what are they doing in your library and how to use them to start a Gmod server. This is classic Valve, small quality of life updates that don't really get flashy headlines, but they make the deck feel more polished over time. Now, I'm interested to know, because I always say this, wait with the updates, especially the beta updates. They will break your decky plugins, and I'm interested to know, are you running stable or beta client on your Steam Deck? And do you experience a lot of issues if you are on beta? I've kind of dialed back with the beta updates. I checked them out so I can cover them in the news, but I've been using stable recently because I'm working on a huge video about top 10 RPG games on the Steam Deck, and I kind of needed to be stable without any issues. And now, let's talk about something that hasn't gotten nearly enough attention but absolutely should. Turkey is currently reviewing draft legislation that could impose severe access restrictions on major gaming platforms, including Steam and Epic Games. Now, I couldn't care less about Epic Games, but Steam, that's a pretty big issue. Now, under the proposal, any gaming platform above a certain daily user threshold would be required to open a local office in Turkey and appoint an official local representative. And platforms that refuse could see their traffic throttled by up to 90% by the country's communication authority. To put that into perspective, downloading a modern 100GB game could take months, like literally. And that's not a restriction, that's effectively a ban. The draft law also mandates that every game sold in Turkey must carry an official age rating like PEGI or ESRB, and that sounds reasonable on paper until you realize tens of thousands of indie games don't actually have formal ratings, largely because the actual rating is expensive and optional in most regions. And industry estimates suggest up to 60% of Steam's catalog, mostly indie games, could become unavailable in Turkey overnight. I personally have Turkish friends on Steam, and I can't begin to imagine how they would feel if this happens. Imagine suddenly losing access to half your library. And this one honestly worries me more than most platform regulation stories. I understand protecting minors and wanting legal accountability, but this approach feels incredibly heavy-handed. You're not just regulating platforms here, you're cutting people off from games they already paid for and potentially wiping out access to indie developers entirely. So, simple question, if your country blocked Steam tomorrow, should you lose access to your existing library? Yes or no? Maybe we should all just buy a ton of hard drives and download everything in our library and just prepare for an event like that. And keep this in mind, this isn't happening in isolation. When you combine this with EU regulation efforts and legal pressure on Valve, a clear pattern starts to form. Governments want more regulation for big social platforms, especially for gaming, like the one Steam is. And that brings us straight into Valve's biggest legal challenge yet, this time in the UK. A $656 million class action lawsuit against Valve has been cleared to proceed in the UK. The case claims Steam's 30% commission, pricing rules and DLC restrictions caused UK players to overpay, potentially affecting 14 million users. On top of that, Tim Sweeney from Epic Games has reignited criticism. Of course he has, that's like part of his job description nowadays. And he's arguing that Steam prevents developers from directing players to alternative payment methods. And his comparison is that Apple and Google were forced to allow this, but Valve hasn't been forced to do so yet. Now, I think this is where things get very complicated. Steam absolutely provides huge value. Features, infrastructure, Proton, Steam Deck, all of that matters. But I do think it's fair to question whether one platform should take a cut of every future transaction forever. But I think in this specific case, this lawsuit holds no ground whatsoever. It's good to ask these questions, but to make such demands with some false claims, it's not gonna go anywhere. First of all, half the claims in this lawsuit are kind of false. Steam absolutely does allow you to purchase DLC for games in an alternate market with alternate payment methods. One example is if I purchase a DLC for a Ubisoft game on the Ubisoft store, it will be added to my Steam account as well, if they're connected. It's also interesting that people decide to target Steam while they ignore corporate big tech companies that are much more deserving of public scrutiny, like for example Microsoft, who make you install the Xbox app with every Windows installation, regardless if you're an Xbox customer, and they also charge 30% for selling on their platform, so it seems like 30% is the standard. The claim argues that Valve's strong position in the PC gaming market allows it to keep this commission of 30% in place without real competition pushing prices down. How is it Valve's fault that the competition isn't good enough even when they're offering free games every week and players think Steam is a platform so good they don't buy a game unless it's on there? I personally think this lawsuit is going to go nowhere, but if anything comes out of it, I'm sure Tim Sweeney from Epic Games will be the first to let us know. Now, do you guys think Steam's 30% cut is fair? Or has Steam become too powerful to self-regulate, and are we going to see more government crackdowns like this? Let me know in the comments below. So between EU consumer protections, rising Steam Deck adoption and legal pressures on Valve, PC gaming is clearly entering a new phase this year, and I'm really curious where all of this lands over the next year. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, I read all of them. If you guys enjoyed this breakdown, hit the like, subscribe, join the SteamFlow Steam group and follow the Creator page for deck-specific performance breakdowns and recommendations. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.